The release of Xanathar's Guide to Everything brought us 3 sorcerer subclasses for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. One was the Storm Sorcerer, and it was a reprint from the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide. Unfortunately, that one received no mechanical changes. 2 of the sorcerer subclasses were brand new. One was touched by Celestial Heritage or Celestial Bloodline, and it was the Divine Soul Sorcerer. The other was touched by the Shadow Fell. Welcome to the Twisted Tentacle Inn. I'm your innkeeper, and today we'll be talking about the Shadow Magic Sorcerer. I want to take a second and thank all of my patrons. Thank you guys for all the support. If you want to support my channel, I do have a Patreon and I'll link it below, or you can like and subscribe the video. Thank you very much. This video is part of a very long series of videos about the Sorcerer class. If you haven't watched my videos on the base class features and the Metamagic options, I recommend that you do that before you watch this video. Also part of the series, I made videos for each spell available to the Sorcerer class, and I've broken them down by spell level, so I've made a video for every single spell level, and I've included in those videos the Metamagic options that work and don't work with each of those spells. Check them out. I'll link them all in the video description down below. Now, I won't be discussing regular sorcerer spells in this video unless there's some kind of interesting interaction with the specific subclass. If you want a detailed breakdown of the spells available to the sorcerer, check out the videos that I just talked about. Alright, let's go ahead and begin. At level 1, when you choose the subclass, you get an ability called Eyes of the Dark. This ability gives you dark vision with a range of 120 feet. Now, most races in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons have dark vision already, but most of those races have a dark vision up to 60 feet. So this is still going to be super helpful to those races that already have dark vision. Of course, there are a few races that already have dark vision up to 120 feet, and if you were to pick one of those races, then this ability is probably going to be a bit of a waste. So definitely keep that in mind when you're choosing your race for this subclass. Definitely don't go for a race that already has 120 foot dark vision unless you absolutely want it for flavor reasons. Now, I've heard some people say that if you already have any kind of dark vision, then this ability is not really that good. I disagree with this assessment. There is a major difference for a spellcaster that has a 60-foot visual range versus a spellcaster with a 120-foot visual range. Especially when you're fighting creatures in darkness, having a 60-foot visual range versus a 120-foot visual range can make a huge difference. I always say that arcane spellcasters should ideally stay about 90 feet from a melee whenever possible. Sure, it's not always going to be possible, but it's highly recommended that if you have the ability to do so, stay at least 90 feet away from the melee combatants. This helps keep you out of range of counter spells, and it also helps you stay at a safe distance even if an enemy were to dash towards you. With only a 60-foot dark vision, you're pretty much going to be at an undesired range. If you're in darkness, let's say, having 120-foot dark vision is extremely helpful in keeping you effective while being able to maintain that distance whenever possible in natural darkness. Plus, a lot of creatures only have 60-foot dark vision, even creatures that are not heroes or player characters. Enemies that you're fighting generally tend to have dark vision at 60 feet as well, which means that if you have 120-foot dark vision and you're far beyond the 60-foot range, they're not able to see you and you can still see them. Some people really overlook this ability, but dark vision is one of the most powerful and underrated abilities in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. I think it's because so many races get dark vision that people tend to take it for granted. But if you've ever played a human or a halfling character, then you know how debilitating it can be to not be able to see in the dark. Also at level 1, you get an ability called Strength of the Grave. If you're dropped to 0 hit points, then you can potentially drop to 1 hit point instead if you succeed a charisma saving throw. The DC is equal to the damage that you've taken that brought you down to 0. It's kind of like the half-orc ability that lets you go back to 1 hit point when you're reduced to 0. But this one is not as good as the half-orc ability. First, you have to make a saving throw, which at lower levels should be simple, but at higher levels it's going to be sometimes an impossible saving throw, so you have zero chance of success sometimes. With the Hackfork ability, you always drop to 1. You know, you get 1 use per long rest, but it is a guaranteed success. You're not going to be making a saving throw. With the Sorcerer ability, you also can't use it if the damage that brought you down to 0 was a critical hit or was made using radiant damage. With the Half-Orc ability, does not have those limitations. Now, even though I'm comparing the two abilities, it doesn't mean that you can only have one and not the other. You certainly can choose to be a Half-Orc and be a Shadow Magic Sorcerer and get the benefit of both abilities. And that way, you can take a hit, use your Strength of the Grave. If that fails, then fall back on the Half-Orc ability. Or if the save succeeds, you still have the Half-Orc ability to keep you at 1 hit point should you take damage again that will drop you to 0 hit points. Now, one of the issues that I do have with this ability is that it isn't an instant success. I mean, we've already talked about the Half-Orc ability being better because of that. Now, imagine you go 3 or 4 sessions without having to use this ability, which is certainly extremely likely. As a spellcaster, if you're keeping a distance like I recommend to you, there's a chance that you may not go down to 0 hit points for several sessions at a time. So you go 3 to 4 sessions without dropping to 0, and then that one session, enemy scores a critical hit and knocks you down to 0. Well, now guess what? You're not able to use that ability. The one time in 4 sessions where you finally had a chance to possibly use the ability, and it automatically fails to work at all. And then you may go another 3 or 4 sessions without having to roll or to drop to 0 again, which means that now we're talking 6 or 7 sessions, maybe even 8 sessions, where you haven't had a chance to use this ability even one time. So my issue isn't that it's a terrible ability, but it's that it's an ability that most likely you won't even really get to see, or it won't really be useful for several sessions at a time. In the example above, which certainly can be a very realistic scenario here, that player didn't get the benefits of this ability for almost 8 sessions. Now, I will say that at lower levels, this is probably going to come up more often because you have a lot less hit points. You're more likely to go to 0, and the saving throw is going to be much easier to succeed in. So at lower levels, you'll probably get a little bit more mileage out of this ability. But as you go up in levels, unfortunately, it doesn't scale. You don't get a bonus to that saving throw, and therefore, the ability is less likely to succeed. And at higher levels, even though radiant damage is rare, you're more likely to get hit by radiant damage at higher levels than you would at lower levels. So at 3rd level, you learn the Darkness spell, which is cool because you're getting an extra spell known. Any bonus spells that you get as a spell known is always welcome for a sorcerer because you have such limited amount of spells known. Not just that, but you also can cast the Darkness spell using 2 sorcery points instead of a spell slot. So it's a 2nd level spell. Normally, if you were to use sorcery points, that would cost you 3 sorcery points to cast. In this, to convert them into a spell slot and then cast it. In this case, you could just use the sorcery points directly to cast the spell. And if you use the sorcery points to cast it, you get an additional benefit, which is that you can see through this magical darkness with your dark vision. So you get 120-foot dark vision that can see through this magical darkness, and there are very few creatures that can see through magical darkness. Only creatures with additional senses like echolocation, tremor sense, or devil sight are going to be able to see through it. So that puts you at a huge advantage, and it makes this casting of darkness really beneficial. Darkness is already a pretty good spell, and the fact that you can see through it is huge. It adds a whole other level of benefit to the darkness spell. You can literally use it as a defensive tool and hang out in your own darkness, and instead of having to move out of it every time you want to cast a spell, you could hang out inside the darkness and cast your spells right from there in the safety of that darkness where other creatures are not going to know where you're at, and it really boosts your defenses and your survivability as a caster when you have this capability. And remember, even creatures with dark vision can't see into your magical darkness. So if you're hanging out in the back, put this layer of darkness on you, and behind you, you can move about in there and no one's going to know where you're at, and you can sling spells from there while your party is out of the darkness in the melee fighting. You're back there in darkness. Other creatures have no idea where these spells are coming from, and if you have the subtle spell metamagic, it really combos really well here, because you can hang out in that darkness, use this subtle spell metamagic, and guess what? No one knows where these spells are coming from. All they know is they're fighting this party of adventurers, and behind them, 90 feet away from them, there is a layer of darkness. So something happened that's created darkness in the back, and they have no idea that there's someone out there casting spells at them. I think that is a really cool strategy, and it makes the Shadow Sorcerer an amazing kind of stealth caster. Now, whatever you do, don't cast darkness into a melee unless it's absolutely necessary. There are times when you do want to do this. A good example is when your party is fighting kobolds or wolves or creatures that have like pack tactics or have advantage on every attack, or maybe creatures that are invisible. So your heroes, your allies, are going to have disadvantage to attack them, and they have advantage to attack your allies. If you cast darkness, it'll level out the playing field, because if the creatures can't see your allies and your allies can't see the creatures, basically what happens, the blinded condition, how it works, if you can't see a creature, you have disadvantage to attack them. If a creature can't see you, they have disadvantage to attack you. And if a creature is blind and you're attacking them, you have advantage to attack them. So therefore, the two cancel out, which means everybody's rolling straight rolls. So whether they have pack tactics or anything else, or they're invisible, it doesn't matter. You've just leveled the playing field, so everybody's just rolling straight rolls. Nobody's getting attacks of opportunity. It really can help a party who is at a huge disadvantage fighting wolves or kobolds or invisible creatures. Now, that's the only time that I would say I would possibly recommend casting the darkness into a melee. Otherwise, your allies are not going to be very happy with you if you're just casting darkness to try and do something on your own where only you can see inside there. Don't ever do that. Cast the darkness on yourself, far away from the party, unless it's the instance that I mentioned here. Now, one other time when you may want to cast darkness on the group into a melee, if you're in over your heads and the party needs to get away, cast darkness, they can get away. No attacks of opportunity occur when the creature can't see who they're fighting, so at least they're going to be able to get away with relative safety. Now, because this ability to cast darkness and your ability to see through it is so beneficial and helps keep you safe, it's a great defensive advantage, which means that instead of wasting known spells to get some defensive spells like Blur or Mirror Image, now you've freed up those known spells so you can take a few more offensive spells that you can cast from within your darkness. Now, of course, darkness is a concentration spell, so that does create a bit of a problem if you're trying to be a controller or debuffer or buffer. So you're not going to be focusing on control a whole lot if you're going to be using this darkness as a defense. If you want to use this ability with a lot of frequency, then I recommend that you look for spells that don't require concentration, or at least initially. And once you get your next ability at level 6, then I think you do want to pick up a few control spells and concentration spells that help control creatures, but we'll get to that in just a second. At 6th level, you get an ability called the Hound of Ill Omen. This is your signature ability as a Shadow Magic Sorcerer. It takes a bonus action and 3 sorcery points to activate, and once you activate it, you target one creature that you can see within 120 feet of you, and the Hound appears within 30 feet of them. Generally, you're going to want that Hound to appear right next to them within 5 feet, because it does have an awesome ability, which basically gives the creature that you're targeting disadvantage on all their saving throws against your spells. The Hound has the stats of a direwolf, but it's medium instead of large. It also has temporary hit points equal to half your sorcerer level, and here's one thing that's not that good. It rolls its own initiative, and I guess that could be good if you end up rolling a more, well, but, generally you can't really choose your initiative roll, so you have no control of when it's going to go, whether it's going to go before you or after you, and that can be a problem. But you're just going to have to do the best you can with what you've got in that instance. Ideally, you'll want the Hound of Ill Omen to go before you in initiative, like right before you, because then you can position them next to your target, and then once it ends its turn, it's your turn, and you can cast spells on the creature with the hound being right next to them. So if your hound goes before the creature, then your hound will move next to them. There is a chance that that creature moves away from the hound and it's no longer within 5 feet of you, which means it's not going to have disadvantage against your saving throws. So ideally, you don't want the hound to go, then your target, and then you. Generally, you want the hound to go right before you, and then you go, and then whatever else happens. If you get to go before your hound, that's almost as bad as if the hound goes right before the creature. So ideally, you'll want the hound to beat you in initiative and for you to go immediately after the hound. Now, your hound can move through other creatures and objects, but they're considered difficult terrain if it tries to move through them. And it takes 5 force damage if it ends its turn inside an object. At the start of its turn, it automatically knows the target's location, even if they're hidden, which is really cool. And then the hound disappears after 5 minutes if its target is not dead, or if the hound is not dead. So if the target is dead, the hound disappears. If the hound is killed, it disappears. If neither are dead, then after 5 minutes, the hound disappears. Now, this is one of the best abilities that you're going to have access to, so definitely take full advantage of it. Of course, it does have some major limitations. For example, the Hound of Ill Omen is not good against flying creatures, and that can be a problem, especially at the later levels. Once you use the ability, the Hound only attacks the creature that you targeted when you first use the ability, and then it goes away when that creature that you initially targeted dies. And it can't do anything but attack that creature that you targeted, and it can't move anywhere except straight towards that creature through the fastest and most direct route. So you don't have full control of it, and even though it kind of seems like a summoning spell, it doesn't really function like a summoned creature, since it very aggressively just hyper focuses on one target. So don't count on it to do things that a summon would normally do, like defend you or tank damage that's directed at you, that kind of stuff, because it actually can't do any of that. But it deals some damage each turn to the target with no action or bonus action required by you, and as long as it's within 5 feet of the hound, then the target of your hound is going to have disadvantage against every single spell that you cast on them, which is huge. So because of this, I do like taking a saving throw damage cantrip for this subclass. It's the only sorcerer subclass that I do this for. Some of you already know I'm not a huge fan of saving throw damage cantrips, and I'm not talking about like Mind Sliver. Generally, you don't cast Mind Sliver to damage. You cast it for the secondary effect, and the damage is just gravy. That cantrip doesn't deal a whole lot of damage. What I'm talking about is cantrips that are meant to be used on rounds where you're not casting spells and you're trying to help the rest of your group deal damage. So high damage cantrips like Firebolt or Toll the Dead, that kind of stuff. Generally, I'd rather Firebolt than Toll the Dead, because saving throw cantrips, in my opinion, are generally subpar to attack roll cantrips. And if you don't know why, I do have a kind of a rant about it on my Divine Soul Sorcerer video, as well as in my Wizard Optimization Guide series, which is going to be linked in the video description below. But anyways, for the subclass, I do like to take one saving throw damage cantrip. Now, not replacing my attack roll damage cantrip, I like to take one of each for this subclass, because when you're at higher levels, you're fighting big boss enemies, you're definitely going to be using the Hound of Ill Omen against them. And a lot of these big boss enemies are going to have high armor class, and having a saving throw cantrip is probably more likely to hit when you're giving them disadvantage. And not just that, but even if they have magic resistance, the Hound of Ill Omen will counteract that magic resistance, so their saving throw is still a straight roll, and generally that's going to be a better shot at nailing them than an attack if they have really high armor class. So generally, I think against bosses, if you have the Hound of Ill Omen out, a saving throw cantrip is going to be probably superior here, but this is one of the very few exceptions where you will hear me saying this. Now, that said, I also think that it's a really good idea to take some powerful single target control or debuff spells to really make the most out of the Hound's ability. Heightened Spell costs the same amount of sorcery points in 3 sorcery points, but it only works against the first saving throw forced by 1 spell that you cast. The Hound works on every single saving throw that you, for spells that you cast on your target. And that's pretty big because that can really pay off round after round after round. And it has the added benefit of not just giving that disadvantage on the saving throws, but it deals damage every round because it gets an attack against the creature every round, so you're dealing extra damage. And it can also tank some hits if your target decides to attack your Hound, which is not a bad thing because any hit that your Hound is taking is a hit that your party is not taking. It's damage that your party is not taking. The Hound is expensive, no doubt. So my recommendation is conserve some of your sorcery points so that you can use your Hound for the boss fights. It's just really an amazing help in battle against bosses that I think that once you're able to use the Hound of Ill Omen, if you know you're going to be going into a boss, always have a way to use that Hound of Ill Omen when you're facing them. Every single time. I mean, that's your signature ability. You should be doing that against bosses. And even if you're out of sorcery points, I would say one of the few exceptions that you'll hear me say this, convert some spell slots into sorcery points so that you can bring out your Hound. At 14th level, you get the Shadow Walk ability. This one lets you teleport 120 feet as a bonus action anytime you're in dim light or darkness. There's no limit to the number of times that you can do this. The only limitation is that you can only use this while you are in dim light or darkness, and you can only teleport to an area that is in dim light or darkness. This is really great. In my experience, there's always going to be an area that's dim light or darkness, no matter where you are. And even if there isn't, you can always cast a darkness spell using 2 sorcery points, so you can always create darkness and an environment where you're going to be able to teleport if you wanted to. I always say that teleportation and mobility are some of the best things that you can do for tactics in combat and for defense in combat. And this ability basically provides you an unlimited amount of teleports as long as you meet the requirements of the dim light or darkness. And this one is a bonus action, which is fantastic. So because of this, at this point, if you have the Quickened Spell Metamagic, I'd recommend that you replace it with something else. Probably, I would say by now you would have changed Quickened Spell anyways, because you're going to have some spells that are going to give you bonus action abilities. But if you haven't changed it by now, now is the time to do so. And the reason I say this is because your teleport, you're going to want to use this as much as possible, and it takes a bonus action. Quickened Spell turns an action spell into a bonus action. There's a conflict there, and I think why waste sorcery points to quicken a spell if you have something really good that you can be doing with your bonus action? Unless you absolutely have something completely awesome that you'd rather do than teleport, by all means, but that's going to be very, very rare, I think. And that said, this ability is better than most bonus action teleport spells, like Misty Step, let's say. Not only is the range better than Misty Step, but with this ability, you can teleport as your bonus action and still cast a leveled spell on the same turn. If you're casting Misty Step, you're not able to cast a leveled spell on the same turn as casting Misty Step. So that makes this really, really powerful. And it can make you very hard to pin down because you're going to be able to move around, cast spells, and still continue to move around. Not to mention, if you're ever grappled or restrained, you can get out of it as a bonus action. For as long as you're in dim light or darkness, you're going to be able to do this. This spell is also better than something like Far Step, a spell that I really like, and I made a video about it. Because Far Step requires your concentration, this ability does not. So you're going to be able to bonus action teleport, not have to concentrate on it, and be able to use your concentration for something else like your darkness ability. And then finally, at 18th level, you get the Umbral Form ability. This is a very expensive ability. It's 6 sorcery points, and it's a bonus action to use. But it's decent. I mean, it lasts a minute, and unless you're incapacitated, then it ends a little bit early. But while it's active, you basically have resistance to all damage except for radiant and force damage. And you can move through creatures and objects and that kind of thing. Overall, decent, I guess. but it's not going to drastically change how you play your character or your tactics in combat or anything like that. It's mostly a boost to your survivability and a bit of a boost to exploration because you can move through objects and stuff. Most players don't really ever get to play as high at a level as you need to be to get this ability, so you may never really even get to see this ability in use. So just a couple more notes regarding the Shadow Magic Sorcerer. The tactics for the Sorcerer are interesting because generally your tactics when fighting groups of regular enemies versus a boss fight are going to be completely different, at least from my recommendation. What I think you should be doing, use your Eyes of the Grave and your Darkness ability when fighting grunts and just regular enemies. Keep that layer of darkness around you so that you stay safe against groups of enemies while you blast away from the safety of the darkness. And then when you're fighting a boss, concentrate on some kind of debuff or control spell while your Hound of Ill Omen is on them so that you can really lock them down for your allies to beat on them and kill them quickly. So the tactics are very, very different here. Now, of course, you can play it however you want, but optimally, I think these are some of the better things that you can do as a Shadow Sorcerer. And before we go, I do want to talk about Metamagic because this is a Sorcerer subclass. There are a few Metamagics that I recommend for this subclass and some that I don't recommend. Briefly, I definitely think that Distant Spell is a very good Metamagic here, especially if you're using the Darkness tactic that I talked about. Basically, some spells have a 60-foot range, which I always say is not great. Generally, I like spells that have a 90-foot range or more. So a 60-foot range spell is not super good, but if you get the Distant Spell Metamagic, you can turn that mediocre range into something really good, still be within your darkness, 90 feet away from a melee, and extend that range for a spell that normally has a 60-foot range so that you can actually reach your targets without having to leave the safety of your darkness. Distant Spell, definitely not one of the best Metamagics out there, but in the case of this subclass, I think it's one of the better ones. Next, I think Subtle Spell is a fantastic choice here. Again, like I mentioned earlier, once you're in that darkness, other creatures can't see you, but they can pinpoint where you are if you're verbalizing spells. So one thing that you can do is take Subtle Spell, and now you're in this darkness, and it only costs 1 sorcery point to cast a spell using Subtle Spell. So now they don't even know who's casting the spell, where it's coming from. If your DM is actually not metagaming and role-playing properly, the enemies should not be able to tell where those spells are coming from if you're using Subtle Spell within your darkness. Twin Spell is another good choice. I think Twin Spell is always a good choice for a spell, so I don't really need to go too much further into that. I think the best subclass for Twin Spell is going to be the Divine Soul Sorcerer, but any Sorcerer subclass can benefit from Twin Spell because it is probably the most powerful Metamagic out there, being able to double the effects of a single target spell. It's so big that, well, I can't not recommend it for this subclass. Careful Spell and Empowered Spell, always good. Careful Spell if you're doing a lot of area of effect control stuff, like Save or Suck spells, those are always good to use Careful Spell on. Empowered Spell, on the other hand, is very good when doing some area of effect spells like Fireball. It really greatly improves the damage. If you want the calculations on just how good Empowered Spell can be on an area of effect damage spell, check out the Metamagic video, which I linked in the video description down below. Mediocre, I think Quickened Spell can serve a good purpose in the lower levels. I think at the higher levels, you'll definitely want to level out of Quickened Spell, so you want to be able to switch that out for something different if you choose Quickened Spell at your earlier levels. Personally, I don't think you should even take it for this subclass. It's not a bad Metamagic. It's pretty good, actually. But for this subclass, I think Quickened Spell kind of hinders you because there's a lot of abilities that use your bonus action here. Using the Hound of Ill Omen is a bonus action. Using your teleportation at the later levels is a bonus action every round. And then you're going to get a lot of spells that use a bonus action. So you're probably not going to benefit from Quickened Spell as much as you would if you were a different type of sorcerer. Now, the Metamagics I don't recommend that you take, definitely Seeking Spell. This subclass is not necessarily going to be a great blaster, and they're already Seeking Spell is not a great Metamagic because there aren't a whole lot of levels spells that use attack rolls. So Seeking Spell is not something you're going to benefit from. If you want to take Seeking Spell, I think a Draconic Sorcerer is a good one to go with. When I do my Draconic Sorcerer video, that will be one Metamagic I will recommend, surprisingly, and you'll see why once I make that video. Transmuted Spell, you probably aren't going to be using a lot of elemental magic, and if you are, it's going to be far and few in between, so therefore I don't think that you're going to be needing to transmute on a regular basis, so don't waste a known Metamagic on Transmuted Spell because you won't benefit too much from it. Extended Spell, that's a terrible Metamagic. The only subclass where Extended Spell is actually good is the Divine Soul Sorcerer, so skip that one. And then Heightened Spell, because you have the Hound of Ill Omen that costs the exact same amount of sorcery points, it is pointless to take Heightened Spell in this subclass, so do not take that one. And that does it for the Metamagic, and that also does it for this video on the Shadow Sorcerer. I know I covered a lot, and I know there's still a lot more discussion to be had, so if you want to continue the conversation, we can do it down there in the comments down below, or you can join the Discord, and I do have Discord server. I'll link it in the video description, and we can talk about the Shadow Sorcerer, or maybe some things that you've come up with that I didn't talk about in the video. I do hope that you found this video helpful, and if you did, don't forget to click like and subscribe. Thank you guys very much. As always, I'm your innkeeper, and this is the Twisted Tentacle Inn. Check in anytime. I'll talk with you then.